Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a shocking mystery. Tu Tieu arrives at Mrs. Nghia's house, but the door is locked, the home is silent, and Mrs. Nghia has completely vanished right after a devastating bankruptcy. Where did she go? And who is really behind it all? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. Tu Tieu pulled up in front of Nghia's house, with her hand still gripping the steering wheel like she was afraid the whole day might slip away if she let go. The street was quiet. Too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, the kind that makes your skin tighten. She stepped out, the afternoon air warm and dusty, and walked straight up to the gate. Her heart kept saying, "Please be home, please open the door, please let this be nothing." But the front door was shut, not just shut, locked tight. Tu Tieu leaned in, peered through the narrow window slit and saw nothing but dim shadows and stillness. No television sound, no footsteps, no clinking cups in the kitchen the way Nghia always did when she was nervous and trying not to show it. Tu Tieu knocked once, then twice, then again, louder. "Baoi, it's me," she called softly, as if being gentle might convince the door to open. Silence answered her, and that silence felt like a warning. She glanced down the street, hoping to spot a neighbour, anyone who could say, "Oh, she went to the market," or "She's at her sister's," something ordinary. But there was nobody, just the wind pushing dry leaves along the pavement. Her phone buzzed again, another notification, another message thread full of panic. The company is bankrupt, the investment is gone. Tuan's project was a scam. Money vanished. Lin disappeared. Tu Tieu stared at those words until her eyes blurred. Bankrupt. Gone. Scammed. She swallowed hard, feeling that familiar pressure behind her ribs. The pressure that comes when you know something has happened, but you don't yet know how bad it is. This wasn't just business news. This was Nghyia's life, her home, her last safe place. Tu Tieu tried the handle anyway, even though she already knew. Locked. A tiny sound, metal clicking back into place, like the house itself was refusing to speak. Behind her, footsteps crunched on gravel. Tu Tieu turned fast. A man stood near the gate, mid-40s maybe, carrying a small plastic bag of fruit, his face tense like he'd been rehearsing worry all morning. "Are you looking for Nghia too?" he asked. Tu Tieu nodded, cautious. "Yes, I came as soon as I heard something happened." His eyes flicked to the lock. "I've been calling her since yesterday. No answer." He stepped closer, lowering his voice like the quiet street might be listening. "They say the company collapsed overnight. People are saying her money, her house, everything." He didn't finish the sentence, but Tu Tieu heard the end anyway. Everything. Tu Tieu's stomach tightened. She turned back toward the door like staring harder might make it change. The man shifted his bag to the other hand. "Maybe she's inside but doesn't want to open." Tu Tieu shook her head slowly. Nghia wouldn't do that. If she was here, she would answer. Even if she was angry, she would still answer. Her voice cracked at the end, and she hated that it showed. Because the truth was, Nghia wasn't the kind of woman who hid behind locks. Locks were for strangers, not for family. Tu Tieu walked along the side of the house, scanning the windows. The man followed, peeking, calling her name once. Still nothing. The yard looked untouched, like time had paused. A broom leaned against the wall. A small pot of herbs sat by the steps, leaves slightly wilted. The kind of wilt that happens when nobody has been home to water them. Tu Tieu stared at that pot for a long moment. If she left quickly, she didn't even take care of this. That thought hit her harder than the locked door. Because it meant Nghia didn't leave for something normal. She left because she had no choice. The man cleared his throat. "Do you know what really happened? With the money?" Tu Tieu's chest rose and fell. "I heard Nghia invested in Tuan's project. People said it was safe, promising, and then Lin handled the capital. She said Lin's name like it tasted bitter. The man's eyebrows lifted. Lynn? The young woman? Tu Tieu nodded. The man let out a short, angry breath. So she ran? That's what everyone is saying. Tu Tieu's voice lowered. That she took it. All of it. For a moment, the air between them felt heavier, charged with the kind of helpless rage that comes when you realise someone trusted the wrong person. Tu Tieu's mind flashed back. Nghie's tired smile, her quiet pride, the way she tried to look strong for Yuri even when her hands trembled. And Yuri was far away right now, on business, out of reach. Tu Tieu felt that ache like a bruise. She turned back to the gate, her eyes locked on the metal padlock shining in the sun. A lock wasn't just a lock, it was a message, a barrier, a sealed secret. Where would she go? The man asked. Tu Tieu didn't answer immediately because she knew what her heart wanted to say. She would go to the person who ruined her. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Someone saying they saw Nghia near Lynn's neighbourhood, waiting outside a gate. Waiting, not being let in. That detail made Tu Tieu's throat tighten, because it meant Nghia had tried to confront Lynn, and still came away with nothing. Tu Tieu exhaled slowly. The anxious haze inside her began to shift. Worry was heavy, but it was passive, and Tu Tieu couldn't stay passive, not now. She turned to the man. I'm going to Tuan's office. He blinked. Right now? Yes. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were trembling. If anyone knows what happened, it's him. If Nghia trusted him enough to invest, then he owes answers. The man hesitated, then nodded. I'll come with you. Tu Tieu started walking back to her car, but she paused for one last look at the house. The sunlight made it look calm, almost gentle, like the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. But behind that calm was the truth. Bankruptcy didn't scream when it arrived. It crept in quietly like a thief, and it left locks behind. Tu Tieu opened the car door and sat down, hands back on the steering wheel. She stared straight ahead for a second, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders. Not just for Nghia, for Yuri, for the promise of family she'd begun to believe in. The engine started, low and steady, and as she pulled away, the locked house shrank in her rearview mirror, small, silent and sealed. But Tu Tieu wasn't sealed anymore. Her fear was turning into something sharper. Determination. A thin, flickering hope that if she moved fast enough she could still find a clue, still find Nghia, still fix what Lynn had broken. She pressed the accelerator, and the quiet rural street disappeared behind her, replaced by the road ahead, straight, uncertain, and pulling her toward the next door that would either open or reveal just how deep the betrayal really went. Tu Tieu didn't realise how fast she was driving until she hit the first red light, and her whole body lurched forward with the stop. Her fingers were tight around the wheel, knuckles pale. The man beside her, still holding that bag of fruit, kept looking out the window like he was hoping to spot Mrs. Nghia walking down the street, as if this could all be solved by pure luck. But luck didn't live in stories like this, not anymore. When they finally reached Mr. Tuan's office, the building looked exactly like the kind of place where bad news lived. Grey walls, dusty windows, and a reception area that smelled faintly of cheap coffee and old paper. A young receptionist glanced up, bored, until she saw Tu Tieu's face. I need to speak to Mr. Tuan, Tu Tieu said. Her voice was calm, but it had a hard edge now, the edge of someone who had stopped asking politely. The receptionist hesitated. Do you have an appointment? No, Tu Tieu answered. But Mrs. Nghia's life just fell apart, so I'm not leaving without answers. The receptionist blinked, then silently pointed down the hall. Tu Tieu didn't waste another second. She pushed open the office door, and there he was. Mr. Tuan sat behind a cluttered desk, papers stacked like a collapsing wall around him. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes tired, and for a moment he looked older than Tu Tieu expected, like the last few days had hollowed him out. He looked up sharply. Tu Tieu? The surprise in his voice sounded real, but Tu Tieu didn't soften. "Where is Mrs. Nghia?" she demanded. The words landed heavy in the room. Mr. Tuan's gaze dropped to the desk. His mouth opened like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out at first. He swallowed, then finally exhaled. "She's gone," he said quietly. Tu Tieu felt her heart dip. Gone where? Mr. Tuan leaned back and the chair creaked like it was tired too. "She sold the house." Tu Tieu stared at him, not understanding. "That's impossible. That house has been in her family." "She had no choice," Mr. Tuan cut in, voice rough. "The company is finished. The money, the capital, it's gone." Tu Tieu's throat tightened. "Because Lin stole it." Mr. Tuan flinched at Lin's name, then he nodded once, slow and grim. "Yes." The silence that followed was thick, like the air itself didn't want to carry the truth. Tu Tieu stepped closer to the desk, forcing herself not to shake. "Where did she go after she sold the house?" Mr. Tuan rubbed his forehead with both hands. "I don't know. She didn't tell me. She just came to see me once. She asked me only one thing." "What?" Tu Tieu's voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Tuan looked up, eyes bloodshot. "She asked if Yuri knew." Tu Tieu froze. Yuri? Of course, that was the first thing Mrs. Nghia would worry about. Not herself, not the house, not her pride, her son. Mr. Tuan continued, voice low. "She said he was overseas for business. She said she didn't want him to come back and see everything ruined." Tu Tieu's chest burned. So she disappeared to protect him. Mr. Tuan's expression tightened. Yes. Tu Tieu's mind flashed with an image. Mrs. Nghia standing somewhere alone, carrying the weight of an entire disaster on her shoulders, refusing to let Yuri share it. A kind of love that didn't ask permission. A kind of love that bled quietly. Tu Tieu clenched her jaw. Did she go to Lin? Mr. Tuan hesitated. She tried. That answer made Tu Tieu's stomach twist. She went to Lin's house, mister, Tuan said, staring at the edge of his desk. She waited outside, she knocked, but no one opened. Lin was already gone. Tu Tieu felt something inside her snap. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. Mrs. Nghia had been desperate enough to go to Lin's door, and Lin hadn't even faced her. Tu Tieu leaned both hands on the desk. Then we call the police. Mr. Tuan's eyes flicked up. For the first time, something sharp flashed there. Fear, maybe. Or shame. No, he said immediately. Tu Tieu blinked. No? Mr. Tuan shook his head too fast. I can't. Why not? Tu Tieu demanded. She stole everything, his throat bobbed. Because if the police dig, they'll dig into me too. The man beside Tu Tieu shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Tuan's voice dropped even lower. Years ago, I did something stupid. I moved money where it shouldn't have gone. I fixed it later, but it's still there, in the records. Tu Tieu stared at him, disgust and disbelief mixing like poison. So you're staying quiet to save yourself? Mr. Tuan's face tightened. I'm not proud of it, but if I go down, everyone connected to this goes down, including Mrs. Nghia's name, including Yuri. Tu Tieu's hands curled into fists. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to slam her palm into the desk and demand he stop hiding behind excuses. But she also understood something ugly. People who are guilty don't just fear punishment. They fear exposure. Mr. Tuan exhaled, shoulders slumping. Tu Tieu, go home. Let this go. Tu Tieu laughed once, dry, humourless. Let it go. Mrs. Nghia lost her house. Yuri's mother is missing. Lin ran with the money, and you're telling me to let it go? Mr. Tuan's eyes lowered again. I'm telling you, this will get dangerous. Tu Tieu's voice hardened. It already is. A long pause. Then Mr. Tuan spoke, slower now, like he was choosing each word carefully. Yuri is far away. If you do anything reckless, you'll make it worse. Go home, wait, I'll handle it. Tu Tieu stared at him. How? Mr. Tuan rubbed his jaw, exhausted. I'll find her. I'll find Mrs. Nghia. I owe her that much. The promise hung in the air, thin as paper. Tu Tieu didn't trust paper anymore, not after everything she'd seen. She turned away from the desk, and that's when she noticed it. Through the office window, beyond the parking lot, a small landscaped corner where someone had tried to make the place look welcoming. There were flowers, bright, carefully planted, almost out of place in this grim building. Tu Tieu's eyes lingered on them, and suddenly she wasn't in the office anymore. She was in Yuri's garden. Yuri's house had a garden too. Neat rows, soft colours, the kind of place Mrs. Nghia loved because it made her feel safe. Yuri used to trim the leaves himself, patient and quiet, like the act of caring for something living kept him steady. And Mrs. Nghia, she always smiled there, even when she was tired, even when she was worried. Tu Tieu's throat tightened and regret rose like a wave, because she could trace the path of this disaster back to one decision, one moment of trust, letting Lin into their world. Tu Tieu swallowed, fighting to keep her composure, but the room felt smaller now. The papers on Mr. Tuan's desk looked like tombstones, contracts, receipts, proof of loss stacked in messy piles. Mr. Tuan's voice softened, almost pleading. Tu Tieu, please, go home, let me fix it. Tu Tieu didn't answer. She couldn't, because if she opened her mouth, the guilt might pour out too fast. Instead, she turned back and met his eyes. If you find Mrs. Nghia, you call me first. Mr. Tuan nodded quickly. I will. Tu Tieu stepped out of the office, the man with the fruit following quietly. In the hallway, Tu Tieu finally let herself breathe, but it wasn't relief. It was pressure, heavy and relentless. Because now she knew the truth. Mrs. Nghia didn't just vanish. She vanished carrying shame that wasn't even hers, and Lin wasn't just a thief. She was a shadow that had already slipped away. As Tu Tieu walked toward the exit, the flowers outside the window caught her eye again, bright and fragile, blooming like they didn't know the world could turn cruel overnight. And that's when Tu Tieu made a promise to herself, not out loud, not dramatically, just deep in her chest where it would stay real. I'm not waiting anymore, because somewhere out there Mrs. Nghia was alone, and Yuri still didn't know. Tu Tieu stepped into the sunlight, her expression calm but her mind burning. Worry had turned into regret. Regret was turning into resolve, and resolve was about to become action. Tu Tieu rushes to Mrs. Nghia's house after hearing the company has collapsed and the investment money has vanished, but she finds the door locked and the home eerily silent. A visitor confirms Mrs. Nghia hasn't answered calls, deepening the fear that something is seriously wrong. Determined to uncover the truth, Tu Tieu goes to Mr. Tuan's office and demands answers. He admits the worst. Mrs. Nghia sold her house after bankruptcy, and Lin allegedly took all the investment capital and fled. Mrs. Nghia even tried confronting Lin, but Lin was already gone. When Tu Tieu insists on calling the police, Mr. Tuan refuses, terrified his own past financial wrongdoing will be exposed. Outside, seeing flowers reminds Tu Tieu of Uri and triggers crushing regret for trusting Lin, until regret hardens into resolve.